Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Professor Hamamoto. It is Christmas Eve, December 24th, year 2023, 4 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. As you can see, I think I've improved my lighting system here. I got thanks to the support of my patronistas, a new light seems to be doing the trick. And I paid special attention to the sound this time. If it's coming out kind of echoey, please let me know. In fact, let me check it right now just to be sure. The audio, yes, the default audio is to this Audio Technica microphone. It's especially important today since we'll be talking about the Beatles, more specifically, Paul McCartney. And this talk today, and I'm happy to be with you here on this very special day, ladies and gentlemen. This talk today was inspired by two encounters. One is with this book here. It's heavy, excuse me. It's by Paul McCartney. It's 1964, Eyes of the Storm. Not Eye of the Storm, Eyes of the Storm. And you've probably heard about introduction, by the way, to Joe Lepore. You've probably heard a little bit about the anthology or the collection. In fact, I'll show you a little bit of tape here about the backstory of it, but you might not have seen the book itself. I sprung $75. Again, thank you, patronistas. I think Amazon.com gives you a little bit of a discount, but it's still a expensive book. It's all glossy paper. It's produced and bound and printed in Italy, and I haven't opened it up yet. So that's going to be my unveiling, my unwrapping today. And in doing so, we're going to unveil and unwrap a little bit more about the contemporary British Empire, what I call the Anglo-American power system in the title, or the Anglo-American power bloc, BLOC. And came to the realization over a number of years that the Beatles, and the more popular they became, the more institutionalized the Beatles became. I came to the realization that they're a very important component in the cementing, the extending, the maintenance, and maybe even the deepening of the Anglo-American alliance, which we've all read about, right? If you're to any degree familiar with quote unquote conspiracy theory, the theme of the Anglo, which means British, right? The United Kingdom, the Anglo-American, America meaning the United States of America, not to include the Americas like Mexico or Canada or Central or Southern America, specifically meaning the United States of America. Well, that power block came to coalesce during World War II, and I don't have to rehearse the insights of the great political scientists, Carol Quigley, or before him, people like Eustace Muller / Ezra Pound, and all the OGs who are writing about this. So I'll let you fill in the blanks if you're new to that. Many of you, however, no matter how advanced you are in your own self-studies, and I say self-studies because this is not taught at the university. This is not taught K through 12 for sure. This is taught on Professor Hamamoto's YouTube channel of all places. And I am the number one progenitor and probably the sole practitioner of what I call a New World Order theory as an academic, as a scholarly pursuit. All right. So no matter how advanced you think you might be, very few of you understand the Beatles in this larger framework of the Anglo-American alliance. And I'll leave you at the end of this talk, which I'll try to keep within 60 minutes or so, with an excerpt of a really fine documentary produced in Britain, by the way, by a very fine documentary filmmaker, independent documentary filmmaker. I encourage you to see it. It's available on TubeView. So it's not like it's a big secret. It's just not being promoted because it's very much consistent with these New World Order ideas that I have been talking about over the last 3 years in running this channel. in which I pioneered at the University of California, Davis campus, um, many years ago, probably 2000, I think 2004, 2005, I'd say 2005, 2006. I revamped my entire theory and methodological approach in teaching my courses at the university. And I came up with the New World Order theory as being the grand theory to explain the anomalies, to put it lightly, the contradictions, the downright evil that has befallen the world in the modern era, however you want. You want to say the modern era started in the 1500s? You want to say the post-war era? Pick your periodization. It doesn't matter. Well, it does matter, but the point is that the the models, the theoretical, the methodological, the historiographic models that are taught in education, K through 12, and in the university, are inadequate. They're not wrong. They're inadequate, right? And today, as we know, most of it is Marxist inflected, right? Or pseudo-Marxist or wannabe Marxist, Marxistic. That has seemed to be the generational takeover as a consequence of the 60s radicalism, which part was, by the way, was part of it was paved with by the great cultural, I won't call it cultural revolution because that means Maoism, right? But the great cultural turnover in the Western world, the Anglo-American bloc of the power system, as led by the Beatles. They were I don't think there's any argument about that. There's all kinds of great groups in the quote unquote 60s and solo artists, right? But I'd say, beyond dispute, I just think it's safe to say that the Beatles are far and away the most influential uh, in the music, the lifestyle, the sexuality, just a whole different uh, transvaluation of value, but however you want to describe it. Revolutionary, Revolution 9, Revolution 10, and it's an ongoing revolution because we have a new generation of people, young people as well, who are adopting the Beatles as a totemic presence. And I'm using totemic in the anthropological sense, like Claude Lévi-Strauss wrote a book called Totemism, translated as Totemism. And his argument is that the people, let's say, of Alaska or the native people who had so-called totem poles were not worshiping the poles as such, the artifacts. They were not worshiping, but they were trying to come to grips with certain contradictions within their society, right? Even a tribal society is very complex. And so the totem helps people think through some of these problems, the issues that they're being faced with, whether it's hunger, aggression, violence, warfare, being displaced, colonized. These are totemic problems. And I think there's a brilliant insight by Lévi-Strauss, who's not mentioned very much anymore. I think the Marxist faction kind of overwrote him and inserted. I won't get into it. They inserted people like Frederick Jameson and Derrida and these other continental and Anglo-American theorists. And of course, hardcore Marxists were always kind of lurking in the background. Your hardcore Maoists are still very much an activist presence, but the theoretical part of it is housed in the university. So anyway, this is all really sort of abstract. When it gets down to the Beatles, I don't know if Paul McCartney was thinking about this when he was snapping away with his new camera. A Japanese-made camera, by the way, Contax or Pentax. I guess I have a Contax. This is a Pentax. And part of the Anglo-American ascendancy, the power block is full of these contradictions of where former enemies of the empire, the Anglo-American alliance, like Japan, rose in the post-war years. And same way with China, or China, as they might say in Liverpool, and the Chinese, as they say in Australia. And I mention that because in and I'll get to this in a moment. But in the process of preparing for this talk, I rediscovered the whole concept of Chinatown. If you're an American, if you're living practically anywhere in the world, there is a Chinatown in a location near you. But I'm most familiar with the ones in Los Angeles, where I grew up near, and San Francisco has a huge one. And New York, of course. I lived in the Village, right off Washington Square. I can walk to Chinatown. It's right around the Southern District Court in New York. It's a bustling, and on and on. Toronto, you name it. And I found out that the Liverpool Chinatown was the very first one in Europe, and I think it remains the largest in terms of population. I don't know about in size, in acres or hectares, how large it is, but it's a significant settlement of Chinese people. And so, what does that have to do with the Beatles? Well, hey, you know what? Um, John Lennon was a rice king. We call them Asian people call or Asian Americans call white guys who go after yellow women. We call them rice kings. And there's also gay men who like Asian men. They're called rice queens. Well, John Lennon was a rice king. So I always wondered why. I mean, how did he hook up with Yoko Ono, right? People say, oh, yeah, well, she was a spy and she was an agent and she was a controller. And now she's being rehabilitated by the new generation of people who are going the other direction. So, oh, she's a genius so far as being an artist, right? With the post-war Japanese and American avant-garde. And by the way, I think that was a synthetic construct as well. I mean, it was real, but I mean, it was funded. And I mention this because a lot of people who are Beatle haters keep pounding away, even in 2023, that they were the faux Fab Four, FAUX. They were fake, they were synthetic. And I beg to differ. In fact, I'm not going to beg. I'm going to demand to differ. And I mention that because I'll show in a moment an excerpt of a discussion between a friend and a new friend and a new colleague of mine, Matt Williamson, who runs the channel Pop Goes the 60s. They're a really good one. Because the people out there who are doing material on the 60s, quote unquote, whether they're boomers or even early younger people, or people who have channels dealing specifically with the Beatles or Jangle Pop or whatever, it's really inconsistent. And that's part of one of the reasons why I'm doing this talk. And I'm going to start throwing down some of my own thoughts that I have articulated. I've written about them to a certain degree, but I've never really made it a focal point of my work, my academic, my scholarly work. But I think it's time right now because as Matt Williamson and his interlocutor, her name's Professor Erin Weber, she wrote a book about the Beatles and historians. There's a new dawn coming, or that has broken about understanding the popular culture. And I mentioned before many times on this channel that I was early in on popular culture studies. I got a master's degree at Bowling Green State University, Ohio. This is in northern Ohio, outside of Toledo, south of Toledo, Ohio. And I was that much into it. This is back in 1975, 76. And I maintained that interest all the way through to the present. So this is not something new to me. In fact, what's very interesting is that because I'm catching up with some of the literature, right? And one of the books that was recommended to me by Matt Williamson was this one by an academic, right? Aaron Weber is a professor. John Stewart here is a lecturer, which is equivalent in the British system, is equivalent to assistant professor. I don't know if it's a tenured position or what, or if you're working at will. But anyway, it's called Dylan. He's an academic. He's also was a pop star. Dylan, Lennon, Marx, and God, right? And two of the people that he uses to understand Dylan and Lennon are academics, both of whom I've met. And I won't say I knew them, but I've encountered them. One was Frederick Jameson, who was at UC San Diego. He's a leftist, post-Marxist, new Marxist literary theorist. But I'll get into this a little later when I have a special show or two with Matt Williamson. We'll talk about this. And the other person was R. Serge Denisov. And I was attracted to Bowling Green. He wasn't in the popular culture department. He was in sociology, but he was one of the early people in academia. We're talking about 75 now. And he was on this earlier, but he was one of the first figures to really talk about protest music in specific as being worthy of serious consideration. So anyway, Dr. John Stewart uses Denisov's typology or framework in order to understand the Marx and the Beatles and Dylan. None of them who are Marxists. I don't even think the author John Stewart himself was a Marxist, unlike R. Serge Denisov. His name was Ron, by the way. So I'm just telling you this because I lived the history. Do you understand? I'm not some guy who's the son or daughter of some rich guy who bought his offspring a YouTube channel and gave him a bunch of book contracts and hookups, right? I come from the grassroots, just like the Beatles did, all right? But in their case, it was concrete. So was mine in Liverpool. And I'm not going to get too far into it, but if I do undertake a major survey of the Beatles phenomenon in British popular culture in general, which I'm deficient on because I've only been to England once, and I've never been to Liverpool. I'm only getting it secondhand through the literature and through the wonders of Tube View, right? But I realize how important the sense of place is, not the sense the reality of place is in doing this type of work, right? You got to get out of your armchair and go check it out. You have to do it. You have to live it, right? This is why the Beatles did covers of the African American experience, and they never claimed to be Black artists. They admired them incredibly well. And why is that important? Because it so happens, and not so happens, it's a historical point of fact, and it's very important that Liverpool was one of the world cities of its day that was pivotal to the world slavery system. You notice I say world, it was not just African American, it was a world system. There's a theory called world systems theory. I'm not going to go pedantic on you, right? And but there's a framework there that I'm working on or working through, just like Professor Stewart is and Professor Weber, in trying to understand a very complex phenomenon, which people try to simplify by saying, oh, they were a construct of some sort of demonic entities, the Tavistock, the Committee of Three. I know the genealogy. I know where it comes from. And it's lies, it's disinformation by the very people that you think that the Beatles were products of. Right? Very similar to ufology of today, right? It's all these mind games. Hey, didn't John Lennon do an album called Mind Games? Didn't he keep saying, and at least more than once, he said, nothing is real, right? He found out. Yeah, I found out, Day Tripper, all these coded meanings in their songs that were supposedly written by Arnold Schoenberg. Right? That's another one that's ridiculous, right? And as much as I attempt to laugh it off, I have to grapple with this line of thinking seriously, whether it's QAnon, whoever else, because this undermines the political effort, the cultural effort, right? By all these limited or unlimited hangouts, the psyops, whatever you want to call them, that are applied to almost everything. It's almost like a knee-jerk reaction these days amongst supposedly people on our side, right? The indie people, the independent thinkers, the Trump herd, right? The herd of independent minds. everything is a conspiracy now, which is a success of a conspiracy. Once you think that everything's a conspiracy, then conspiracy theory has won. Professor Adam Weishaupt, here's another professor for you, by the way. I'm telling you, this branch of knowledge and work, which was under theorized and understudied when I started into it in the 70s, but there were some pioneering people like Professor Ray Brown and Professor Michael Marsden and Professor Joseph Arpad, and of course I mentioned Professor uh, Denisoff. They were all Bowling Green, which is an obscure state. Mostly they train teachers as their teachers' college. But it doesn't matter. I'll go where the action is. When I just like when I knew that their critique was missing ethnicity and race, I went to UC Irvine, which had a comparative culture PhD program, and look where it's taken us now. The mainstream, the establishment has taken race and ethnicity and weaponized it. Originally, it was an important vacuum that needed to be filled. And I'm mentioning this is because I'm looking at the Beatles themselves, each individual member, as ethnic individuals. They are part of what might be called the Irish diaspora, right? You're familiar with the Jewish diaspora, right? It's in the Bible. Diaspora is a Greek word. I don't know what the literal definition is. It means a scattering, I suppose, of people. And that is characteristic of not just Jews or Irish, and there's millions of descendants of Irish people all over the world. I'm talking about United States of America specifically here, but Canada, Australia, the English-speaking world, and they have enriched the world culture coming from, Ireland to an incredible extent. And it's mostly because of their attitude, and they refuse to be vanquished, even if it's the Pope of Rome. I was in London when the Pope came to Ireland. The Pope, I don't know if there were two popes at the time, but he came in and none of the Irishmen showed up. Very few. They were pissed off because they saw how the Church of Rome had pretty much abandoned them after setting up Saint Patrick. Anyway, I don't want to digress too much, but getting to the point, back to the point, I view even Richard Starkey, who was not Irish, he was an Anglo-Saxon, I guess you'd have to call him so far as ethnicity is concerned. Everybody has an ethnicity, right? Even quote unquote white people are ethnic people, but there are some. I'm not going to claim an original find on this, but not very many people understand the Beatles, the individuals, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, or maybe John Lennon, because he did that song with Yoko Awesome. Um, I'm sorry, Yoko. I'm not a big fan of her, just because she's a yellow person. Doesn't necessarily mean I embrace her. Right, give Ireland back to the Irish and Yoko back to Japan. That song, "The Luck of the Irish." So that was part of his repoliticization period, right? John Lennon, we're talking about, and one of the reasons why some people, historians, serious historians, think that he was assassinated back in December of. See, when was it? He was 40 years old. It's 1980, right? And there's still controversy over it. And one of the books, by the way, that you need to check out, even if you're a casual listener of the Beatles music or the Beatles phenomenon, you have to look at the book by Fenton Bresler, Bresler. He was a barrister by training and a journalist, and he wrote a book on who killed John Lennon. And very few of these books that I've been looking at recently, the more recent scholarship, cite the book. It's obviously they haven't read it, but it's a key text. And again, I told you there's a vacuum here, and I'm trying to fill it in because I've been around. I've been doing this so long, and I've been reading these books as they've come down the pike. I mean, when Lennon Remembers, the anthology, 2 volumes, were published by Rolling Stone Press. I have them, by the way. They're worth tons of money. I bought them when I was a kid. And I read the original articles when they were appearing in Rolling Stone magazine before it went globalist. Once I think Jan Wenner left the magazine around 2019. But if you read it now, it's all globalist tripe. They took the brand, just like rock and roll, just like the Beatles. They took the brand and they converted it for their own use, right? This is why the critical functions that we are engaged with right now at this moment and beyond are so important because the enemy never sleeps and neither do we. But unlike the enemy, we're going to have some fun. We're going to have some fun tonight. Everything's all right. Right? To paraphrase the Beatles via Little Richard, right? Petit Richard, Little Richard, Richard Penniman of Macon, Georgia, right? And getting back to the early point before I forget the important, Liverpool is one of the center of the African slave trade, the preeminent center of the African slave trade. So when the Beatles come around, it's kind of like a completion of the circle, right? That transatlantic route between connecting that circuit, that trade circuit, not just of goods and merchandise, but of human beings, the trafficking, right? Which supposedly we're dealing with now. It's an old problem. It predates capitalism, human trafficking. And it's a part of a commercial system, right? It's not an aberration. It's integral to it. This is what makes it so difficult to uproot and to get to the bottom of it because it's integral. It's wed to the quote unquote straight, legitimate, constitutional or monarchical system. Right? And we'll get into that part of it at the end when we discuss how Britain lost its geographic empire and the United States, my homeland. I'm a third generation American. Well, took the geographic policing of the world, and Britain moved its wealth offshore. And I mentioned the importance of this because this is the crisis we are going through right now. And there are all these promises being presented by Bitcoin and FTX, and Samuel Bankman-Fried is a little bit of a distraction here to kind of check the public mood about how is crypto going to be a way that we can bail ourselves out. I'm talking about the bankers, right? And how are you going to accomplish the Great Reset, right? Most people are talking about Klaus Schwab and Eat the Bugs as the Great Reset. They parody him, right? But the Great Reset is really about the Great Reset of the world economic order. And you know all about gold and fiat currency, the Federal Reserve, so I don't need to go through that. So anyway, before I go on, and I am going on, let me take my Spyderco knife here. The blade's made in Seki, Japan. I mention this because international trade, through Britain, through the United States. By the way, some of the best, I think the best, even rivaling collections that I saw in Japan, the best collections of katana, samurai swords, as it's known, right, is in the British Museum, right, because of the trade, because of the imperial connection here. And I mention this because this is one of the key takeaway points. I have to think about it a little bit more, but I think he's on the right track. John Stewart, Professor Stewart here, Dr. Stewart. The Beatles are reflective of an empire in decline, right? Despite all the mania behind Beatles, right, John, Paul, George, Ringo, which I lived. I think I was 10 years old when the Beatles hit America. I was 10 years old when I saw them on, just like you, on the Ed Sullivan Show, sitting in my pajamas. All right. And I wanted to abandon the clarinet. I'm opening this up right now as I talk. Hopefully I won't cut myself on air. But yeah, the Beatles made me want to give up the clarinet for a guitar. And I still have a passion for the music, not just their music, but especially their music. So I'm unwrapping this for you. We'll take a quick peek at it before we move on with the talk. Since this is Christmas Eve, right? We're all about unwrapping gifts. Well, this is a gift to myself that I think I got it last year. Here it is, ladies and gentlemen. Quoting Paul McCartney, says, "Millions of eyes were suddenly upon us, creating a picture I will never forget." A personal foreword in which McCartney recalls the pandemonium of British concert halls, followed by the hysteria that greeted the band on its first American visit. Candid recollections preceding each city portfolio that form an autobiographical account of the period McCartney remembers as the eyes of the storm, plus a coda with subsequent events in 1964. So I'm going to have some fun looking at this book later on and probably for years to come. Beatle Land, an essay by Harvard historian. Oh, good. They've Harvard finally caught on. Right? It's always the little small schools that do the real difficult work, and then once it's proven to have legs and substance, then Harvard and the elite schools will come and steal it and take it. Just like Professor Claudine Gay, right? She's the president of Harvard. She's on the hot seat for plagiarism. She ripped off a lot of guys. I'm from that world. From what I can tell, her work fits the definition of plagiarism, right? If you look in the dictionary of plagiarism, you'll see her picture there, Claudine Gay, president of Harvard, who was one of the chief perpetuators or perpetrators, let's say, of so-called cancel culture, whatever that is. I never understood that concept. But she was saying, no, 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 that's racist, that's sexist, that's homophobic. And the Harvard Corporation, which is Anglo-American, by the way. Okay, that's how it fits into my rambling talk here. They might have been fooled. Her name's Gay, but I guess they said, well, that takes care of the GLBTQ lobby. And she just like a man. She's like polyethylene Pam. She's so good looking, but she looks like a man. Anyway, so you got Beatleland, an essay by Harvard historian, and New Yorker essay, Jill Lepore. Okay, this puts the imprimatur, the stamp of approval by Harvard University, describing how the Beatles became the first truly global mass culture phenomenon. Well, I bet you your bottom dollar that Jill Lepore, a professor at Harvard University, does not understand the Beatles the way I do in terms of these transatlantic world cities predicated upon these power relationships between the imperial core and the center, right? Or the imperial core and the peripheral countries, of which the United States was once one of them before we got into revolution. We went to Revolution 9. And you might make the argument that Britain never really went away as a result of the revolution. Oh my gosh. Just, yeah. Paul McCartney was a talent, for sure. Multi-talent. Anyway, I'm going to read this at some other point, and I thank the patrons for gifting me this or gifting myself. And I'll come back to it. Maybe I have a large bed scanner. Maybe I'll scan some of the photos. They're not as good as seeing it in paper or in the exhibit. I hope that the exhibit that first was mounted at the National Gallery, the National Portrait Gallery in London, becomes they have a traveling I hope that becomes a reality, because it's good to see the aura of the photographs, even supposedly in the age of mechanical reproduction. The aura disappeared with photos. I beg to differ. Photos are very powerful. You know who I'm alluding to. These are all the people we read in grad school. Right. Walter Benjamin. All right. So let's take a look at Paul McCartney, kind of wistfully looking at some of his work in the gallery here. Rose and Valerie sitting in the gallery. Maxwell must go free. See, my whole life is a bunch of lyrical references to Beatles songs. Yes, go see the exhibit if it's still up. Hopefully there'll be a traveling version of it as well. Someone came into the chat room and challenged me to prove the existence of the African slave trade. Jack, you need to put on the training wheels and go listen to Steven Crowder or some of these retread comedians, Gret Gredfield or someone like that. I mean, you can go to the library and find any book on the topic, but don't come into my house with such stupidity. All right. You never give me your money, right? Something that Matt Williamson told me I needed to read. It's been around. I haven't read it. Primarily because it's about the Beatles after the breakup. So I'm starting to dip into it. The reason why I'm mentioning it here is because Professor Aaron Weber wrote an entire monograph. I think it was probably her doctoral dissertation, talking about the Beatles in history. And I'm in the field, right? So a lot of what she's telling me is self-evident. But a lot of the ass clowns who write about the Beatles and talk about the Beatles and post on the Beatles have no idea of what history, the doing of history. It's called historiography. How do you know what historical fact is? Just like this character says, well, I challenge you to prove African slavery. Well, you can go through documents, you can go through anecdotal accounts, you can go to first-person testimony. There's all kinds of criteria that need to be met in order to qualify as fact, or as close to fact as we can get it. So I think this is the stage that we're in now. We're seeing more academic type. I don't know if that's necessarily good, right? But because there's a lot of very, very talented non-academics who've done all the spade work for the academic types. Mark Lewis, and for example, even some of the books that are reviled by people who love the Beatles or read all the Beatles books, people like Albert Goldman. He did a excoriating expose, I guess it was, a scandalous book on John Lennon, but he also did some original research and he talked to some people. If you can get over the fact that he was trying to really malign the probably the intellectual focus of the Beatles, meaning John Lennon. Not that Paul McCartney was any slouch either. He's brilliant. Then that's the book you need to read. So I read the earlier ones. I need to catch up. So here's a bit of the discussion between Matt Williamson. This is going on, I think, maybe last year. It's current discussion. And Aaron Weber. Is her first name Aaron? Last name's Weber.
I think any assessment of Paul's pushback and his revisionism has to be integrated into the larger scope of Beatles historiography and the acknowledgement that the Lennon Remembers narrative, the breakup version, and the shout narrative gave us, in certain areas, an incorrect version of Paul McCartney. And so the quicker way of saying that would be Paul has legitimate grievances regarding his depiction in Beatles historiography. And to an extent, all of them do. Mm-hmm. There's a great comment from Ray Connolly where he talks about seeing, I think it's Lennon Naked, the stage show. Mm. And Connolly argues that it just strips John of everything but his anger. His humor is gone, his intelligence is gone, his generosity is gone. All John is in that show is anger. Or you have Ringo talking about how he is still perceived as the bumbling fool from A Hard Day's Night. Mm-hmm. He cannot shake that image entirely. So all of them have grievances and have been depicted inaccurately, not only Paul. The issue with Paul is, however, you had some of the most influential and widely used sources in Beatles historiography, books like Shout, books like Ray Coleman's Lennon, interviews like Lennon Remembers, that originated a lot of these inaccurate versions and marginalized some of Paul's contributions. Mm-hmm. So that's the first thing I would have to say regarding Paul's revisionism. He is defensive. There are statements he has made that have been contradicted by documentation or by other sources. Mm-hmm. He is absolutely not giving us gospel truth any more than any of the others are giving us gospel truth. But he does have legitimate grievances regarding his depiction.
Mm-hmm. Well, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out further with his latest book, which
I have not had a chance to take a look at that. I believe the cost of it is £75. So I'm going to wait to get that on interlibrary loan.
Maybe I'll borrow it from you then.
This is the book that she's alluding to, and I didn't wait for interlibrary loan. I think this is an important document on many levels. And one of the crucial levels that I believe that, if I may, that Professor Weber, and I realize she's talking to addressing a general audience, but one of the important levels that she is missing is that again, the Beatles were part of an Irish diaspora growing up in a world city where commercial activity, to put it mildly, was at a fever pitch, right? They didn't come out of a vacuum. And this is one of the reasons why they had an attitude. Maybe it's epigenetic, going back to the Great Famine, which was not a natural occurrence, by the way. It was a, like all famines are, they are political acts, right? We were taught, right? Remember? Oh, it was a great potato famine. There was a blight that took over and stuff. Well, that part is true. Yeah. Just like, the recent narrative that we came out of over the last, it was some kind of mystery vector from outer space or from Wuhan or from the bats. All right. Can you see similarities of the psyops going on, right? There's Lord Kitchener. He was one of those Anglo-Irish people that, in fact, his father got a lot of property for pennies on the pound or on the dollar or whatever, our equivalent is, after the famine, because the people were busted out, just like right now. We're being busted out so that a new group of oligarchs, or the existing group of bankers and oligarchs, why do you think they're buying houses left and right now, can come in and buy all the capital for pennies on the dollar, right? We see these recurrent patterns. And the Beatles didn't. The individual Beatles, George Harrison, Paul McCartney, Richard Starkey, certainly not even John Lennon, knew this, but in an experiential level, on an emotional level, they were trying to figure out their position in this world where they were held down. At the same time, the British Empire was declining geographically. And this, of course, is, again, one of the main arguments of Professor Stewart here. I think it's his greatest contribution. And he talks a lot about this specifically British cultural and Liverpudlian references that most American historians, cultural historians or otherwise, are lacking, including myself. So if for me to credibly write about the Beatles, I have to live in Liverpool for about a year or so. So if there are any lecturing positions available over at the University of Liverpool or one of the colleges, universities, please let me know. If you need an archivist, I'll gladly do it so I can scout around. And that's typically how I've done most of my research. I just go there. I want to understand the American nuclear energy atomic weapons complex. Well, I went to Hiroshima, Japan, went to the University of Hiroshima, spent a year there. That's not enough time really to get an idea, but you have to really scrutinize it rather than and live it and kind of experience it instead of just being a stay-at-home, a YouTuber. In other words, they're like guys like that in academia too, by the way. They're a dime a dozen. They're jockeys. They're desk jockeys. right? And I don't have much respect for them, and I like to think I'm doing work that's more accurate as a result, right? But let me just give you an idea, because I keep invoking this abstraction, the Irish diaspora. I'm not giving you concrete examples, but let me give you a few names that you no doubt are familiar with, even though you've never read their original work. But certainly you know who Bram Stoker is, the person who is credited with developing the vampire genre. It's almost like a literary genre, right? Anne Rice made a pretty good career out of it, right? That she deserves a talk of her own. Anne Rice, Margaret Atwood, a lot of these sort of darlings of the feminist group who are into vampirism and AI and mind control and all that, and blood sucking. But yeah, so if you want some reference there, I can recommend this book by Nick Groom. He's a British author, excellent. I was introduced to him by a book that's called a very short introduction to the Gothic. And I read that, and I looked through his bibliography and saw he'd written a book about vampires. This is a really good book. It's a social history, and he talks a lot about Bram Stoker. Point is, just to wrap Bram Stoker up in a nice little bag for you here, but he's an Irishman, right? And think about it. What were the British doing with Irish? They were sucking their blood out. He was Anglo-Irish, by the way. He was born of English parents in Ireland, kind of like a landlord, right? Just like you're seeing Chinese come here, super wealthy, who are buying up American assets, and they're running American assets and overseas assets on part of the home government, right? So that's Bram Stoker. Maybe less familiar to you would be Oscar Wilde, right? Remember The Portrait of Dorian Gray, that story, that movie? And he famously was thrown in jail. He wrote a poem, Ballad of Reading Jail, about him being thrown into prison for committing acts of indecency, which he was gay, right? And by the way, being gay, that was punishable by law in Britain till around the Beatles time, around 63 or 4. The national draft ended, right? The rationing ended not that long before. The British people were really deprived, especially Liverpool, remember, was bombed during World War II. I think most of the gold that was being stored in London, the treasury, was shipped up to Liverpool for safekeeping. And the Germans found out about it, and they bombed the hell. And it's a shipping commercial port, so they bombed the hell out of Liverpool. And a lot of that gold, this is another story, was sent to Canada overseas, right? So Oscar Wilde was, I think, wasn't he on the cover of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band? I don't know, but his whole career has become sort of a touchstone for the gay GLBTQ movement, la-di-da, right? He went to jail, though, and he had talent. He was a literary artist and a wit, right? A late Victorian Edwardian wit. So you got him, Oscar Wilde. You've got George Bernard Shaw, or Bernard, as the Americans say. But Bernard Shaw was an Irishman, and most of you know him, people who are in my group here, know him because you've read enough about Tavistock, and you've read enough about Fabian socialism, and specifically, he was one of the kingpins of Fabian socialism. That famous logo of theirs with the turtle? The turtle is just slow but sure, but they're going to gradually bring socialism and communism into the developed capitalist world. And we know now that socialism and Fabian socialism and capitalism, because I could never figure it out, are a product of the capitalists themselves. They create most of the opposition movements, right? If you want to beat the opposition, become the opposition. So that's George Bernard Shaw, another wit and playwright and man of letters who was an Irishman who moved to London town to gain his literary fame. Just like Bram Stoker, he had to go to London to join the theater scene and become a literary man. And we should remember that. I think John Lennon was very much, people talk about how influenced he was by Lewis Carroll. Yeah, it's really obvious. But I think he was really influenced a lot by the great James Joyce, who was, I believe, born and bred in Dublin. Before he left, he split. He became a rootless cosmopolitan. Right? He famously went to Paris and went to the Sylvia Beach bookstore with all the other expats, right? Because it was cheap living there. And he got his book published, I think, by Shakespeare and Son, right? Ulysses, which is a masterpiece. And before that, there was a short story, more conventional short story, Dubliners, and Finnegan's Wake especially. You can see a lot of Lennon in, or Joyce in Lennon. I don't know if Joyce did any sketches, but the different puns and the little word games that Lennon relished and enjoyed, a lot of it, I think, owed to his Irish heritage, epigenetically, right, of being the Liverpool Irish. Another area that I am pushing forth here, and this might take you some time to wrap your mind around, because earlier on in this talk, I alluded to Chinatown and John Lennon being a rice king. So how did he fetishize, yellow women, Orientals, as they called them back then, or Chinese or Japanese, right? Especially Japan, man. Britain had gotten run out of the Malaysian peninsula. The Japanese came down with their bicycles and drove them out. There were not these huge set battle pieces there. The British Empire was already, military was going down. You know this, right? Along with the empire, the geographic empire was faltering, to put it mildly. Well, because the reason why John Lennon was a rice king is because Liverpool has the largest Chinatown in Europe. Maybe as a Liverpool Irish lad, he would go over to Chinatown and, dip his wick into some Oriental mystique. Who knows? This is something I'd have to check out for myself. All right. Others are doing this, primarily people of the Chinese diaspora, many of them who, in order to avoid competition and sort of racist-based attacks, go into Chinese takeaway, or we call it in America takeout places. Well, they've pursued their lives for 3, 4, 5 generations now in Liverpool. They've been there since like 1840 because they're a part of the empire. Right, just like we're seeing lots of people here coming into the United States uninvited. That's part of the imperial process. You destroy the countries of the imperial periphery, and a number of them come into the imperial core, which is the United States, America. Right, that's why they're here. And the same thing with the British Empire. Lots of Chinese came into the port of Liverpool, which used to go back and forth to Hong Kong, which, as you know, until recently was a British possession, when it should have belonged to the Chinese. So here you go. Here's just a very brief look at it. I think this is a BBC production too. So even Auntie Beeb is getting the message that Britain has long been a quote-unquote multicultural society, and they have to grapple with it.
Chinese people in the world, you'll probably find a takeaway. In the 1950s, immigrants from Hong Kong and the New Territories came to the UK to start a new life. By the 1970s, Chinese takeaways were big business, with one in every town. That's because families moved to avoid competition, which meant that their children were oftentimes the only Chinese people in the whole school. As the parents didn't always speak good English, the children that grew up in the UK spent their childhoods helping out at the takeaways. These are the takeaway kids. Hey, what number is this?
That's the Cantonese style one, so that is 23A.
S19 on my menu, if I remember correctly.
What about you?
That was A25.
Okay, you can pursue that on your own. Now, to help support my hypothesis, I checked out this recent release on Blu-ray DVD. Can you see it? The Lost Weekend, a love story. It's about May Pang. It's told, or Pang, she pronounces it. Her parents didn't run a Chinese restaurant. They ran a laundry. It's called OK Laundry. It's another area where there would be no direct ethnic competition, so that racist attacks against them, like they'd seen during the California Gold Rush period, where there was, by the way, a lot of Welsh and Irish fought the Chinese, and Mexicans fought the Chinese, and it eventually led to Asian exclusion laws, which were on the books until 1965, fairly recently. The Beatles were already breaking big before Asians were allowed back in the United States of America. So a lot of them probably went to Liverpool. But anyway, this is May Pang's story, The Lost Weekend. And what's interesting about it, it's told from her perspective, through her voice. She narrates the whole deal. And this is quite different from having someone like Professor Riposte from, McCartney's camp, or Professor Weber tell the story for all these people. So what I'm saying is that we need to hear directly the words of the people who were participants in the history, instead of just sitting back and speculating on. And most fortunately for us, there are a lot of the people from the 60s, quote unquote, the 60s, they're still around. And if they're not, they need to be talked to and interviewed and given a platform where they can tell their story. It's an excellent documentary. Primarily, it's not very penetrating, but they do allow May Pang her voice, right? Just like the Beatles struggled to get their voice out in less than ideal conditions and became worldwide stars. I'm not going to say that holds true for everybody, but that is a prerequisite for getting at these core truths. That's part of this enterprise here. So Liverpool, I don't have time here, but I did have a bunch of videos talking about the grandeur of the architecture, right? The late Victorian Edwardian architecture. Man, it is mind-boggling. The Beatles, even though they were working class lads, Lennon was a little bit higher than working class, they weren't privileged, by any means. This is post-war Britain. You remember, we're talking about the late 40s and the 50s. The city itself was one of wealth, right? Unlike today, the captains of industry, the wealthy people who own the warehouses on Albert Docks, and the counting houses and the banks, these churches, with the incredible bells, cast bells. They made their community. They're residents there. They made their community livable, and they had their own social welfare. I'm not trying to romanticize or idealize it, but I'm saying the Marxists and the Labor Party that try to create division and strife within cities like Liverpool were exploiting the reorganization, the decline of imperial Britain. This, just like the United States, some art is in a period of imperial decline. I sometimes despair of that happening here, but I don't think it is, right? I'm telling you, not just to make you feel good on Christmas Eve. I'm telling you this because there's a critical mass of people in the United States of America, even amongst the intelligentsia, right? They're always the last to get it, right? Middle class gets it very quickly because, when we suffer from inflation, we feel it and we're trying to figure out how we get around it, right? But there's a critical mass of people in the United States of America who are understanding phenomena like Taylor Swift or Prince or a given movie star there, or Hollywood as an military industrial entertainment ideological state apparatus, right? A complex. Right? More and more Americans are beginning to get it, and they're going public with it. Even musclehead Joe Rogan, right? The retooled mixed martial artist. He's a bright guy. He goes up to a certain point. He'll go into the New World Order and some of these issues that we're dealing with. And there's tons of people. In fact, the biggest problem we're faced with, people who've been doing indie media for years and years and years, decades in my case. We're being deluged by a bunch of wannabes and pop-up pundits, right? And that's part of the strategy. Well, if that's where they're going, let's just flood the whole market with a bunch of bozos, a bunch of newbies who just plagiarize stuff, right? They just take people's material and they just claim it as their own, and they say, oh, yeah, the Beatles were the best phenomenon, the incredible phenomenon. Really? That was like, what, 50, 60 years ago? Where you been? All right, so to conclude here, and I'll come back after I run this short introductory clip here, but this is how we need to understand phenomena like the Beatles, talking about them as part of an Anglo-American power block or power system, which is financial. And by the way, that's the reason why I think a lot of disinformation is being put out about the Beatles and about them being the devils incarnate, right? Coming from John Coleman's Committee of 300. And a lot of LaRouche people have spawned a lot of the Beatles conspiranoia, right? It's because they want to take us away from the fact that there's an Anglo-American, maybe even Germanic. When we're talking about LaRouche, there's because the Royal House of Britain is at bottom. It's German. It's Teutonic. It's Habsburg, Coburg, right? And Western Europe, most of Western Europe there. This is what the Napoleonic Wars were about, right? We're talking about early 19th century, but we're talking about the early 21st century where the contention for power and ascendancy, imperial ascendancy, remains strong. We're at war right now. We're on two fronts, in Ukraine and in Israel with our client states. One is NATO, and the other one is Israel, right? So this is how I view the world, right? If it spoils your enjoyment of the Beatles, don't let it do so, because I like to sit there and strum away and sing and learn. So, oh, that's really interesting chord progression. Yeah, how did Lennon ever come up with this strange time? I'd like to nerd on it too, but at the same time, you will gain more benefit from your own life if you understand this more than just say, well, Paul said this, John said this, Ringo hasn't had enough platform to really talk about his. I mean, that's petty stuff. With all respects to Professor Weber, who gives a what, right? I'm really interested in the survival of the Anglo-American alliance. I think it could be wonderful, as well as with other countries, if we figure out what's at the bottom of this whole system, right? So take a look at this documentary on your own. We've got some holiday time coming to you, perhaps. You can watch The Spider's Web, but look at this introduction. I'll be back in a couple of minutes to say goodbye to you and wish you a Merry Christmas, but take a look at it. This lays it out for you in a nutshell.
The British soldier. All around the globe you'll find him, from Gibraltar to Hong Kong. Everywhere he stands against the threatening years, staunch symbol of our common will to order.
All right. Hopefully that will inspire you to see the entire, I think it's a 90-minute piece. Let me give a credit to the director. His name's Michael Oswald. He's done a couple other ones, including
The British soldier.
including one on the N, or yen, as we call it in America, the Japanese yen. Right, very, very perceptive critic of the financial system. That's not necessarily Marxist. It's beyond academic Marxism. It's definitely beyond liberal economics. He comes closest to what I'm referring to as New World Order theory here, imperial theory, post-imperial theory. So with that, I will conclude, and I will continue to be reading along these lines. Hopefully, I'll be able to come up with an essay, or perhaps even a book on this phenomenon of popular culture, which I helped pioneer in the modern age, right? And one other name, he was an Irish, but George Orwell is his pen name. You all know it, right? But this is a whole volume, multi-volume, 1920, 1940, an age like this. And he was writing about his role as an imperial British policeman in India or Burma, right? Through letters and through articles, doing reviews. And the empire was already beginning to come apart in 1920, 1940. That's what happened. That's what, to a large degree, what World War II was about. So we're in the 21st century now, right? And we're still thinking about events of 50 years ago. We have to look over the current event horizon. We have to look into the now. That's the downside of these popular culture studies and Beatles stuff, is because sometimes it becomes just an exercise in imperial nostalgia. It's more important to that. It's more valuable as a totemic exercise to figure out where we are in 2021 and where we need to go. Right. My prediction for 2024 is that there will be an upswing, an upsurge, just an explosion, right? If you want to put it in those terms, of younger groups that have broken away from the military, industrial, entertainment, amusement system that has reached its zenith in someone like Taylor Swift, who I do believe is an intelligence asset, right? Just lay off the Beatles for just a while and just look at Taylor Swift and check her out, and her the effect that she's having on the young people of today, right? So I hope you'll join me with this enterprise, this ongoing enterprise, God willing, in the year 2024, the new year. I'll see you there. For the patronistas who've been supporting me for the past 3 years, I'll be sending you dispatches through our private channels, and we'll keep this discussion going. A lot of the material I could not show here because I would get copyright strikes, because Beatles they're very protective of their copyright, their intellectual property. I understand that. But I have other ways of getting information to my core support group. So we'll see you on the other side, the new year. Merry Christmas, happy holidays, peace, prosperity, and health for you all. And we'll see you in 2024, if not before. When does the first start? I'm not going to take a vacation. Right? When most people are playing, I like to work. That's how I maintain my edge. Right? When people are knock off at 5 o'clock, I'm still working. Right? When all the cars in the parking lot are gone, my car's there. I'm burning the midnight oil and beyond. I'm not just bragging about this. This is the way I've always operated, and that's what it takes. That's how the Beatles operated. That's how anybody who makes any sort of contribution will operate. And that's probably how you operate, you thinking people, right? We'll see you soon. Thank you very much. Bye.